My dear brothers and sisters of the World People's Congress for Peace, I bring you warm fraternal greetings from the Caribbean community, CARICOM in general, but more particularly from the world's newest republic, the Republic of Barbados. And I want to assure you that both Barbados and our Caribbean community are deeply committed to the principles of peace, solidarity, universal human rights, brotherhood, and cooperation. In fact, if I look back on our Barbadian history, we became independent in 1966, and immediately our Prime Minister went to the United Nations and told the entire world that Barbados will be an exponent of the diplomacy of peace, and that we would be friends of all, satellites of none. And what he was doing at that time was sending a message to the big powers of the world. This was the time of the Cold War between the West and the Soviet Union. And he was making it clear that we do not accept any Cold War logic. We do not accept that the world must be enmeshed in this kind of big power competition. So we did not accept it in 1966. And I want to say to you that Barbados and the small developing countries of the Caribbean community do not accept it today. We do not accept the logic that says that there's a Cold War between the United States or the West and China, and that somehow we must pick sides in that conflict. We do not accept any logic that says that the Caribbean is in anybody's sphere of influence, or that the Caribbean is in anybody's backyard. In fact, we find that notion extremely insulting and distasteful. So we say this is an age in which the big powers of the world must cooperate, must pursue peace, and must pursue a rational development in the interests of the welfare of the entire world. We are also very clear that the United Nations Charter must be respected, multilateralism must be respected, that the fundamental rules and principles of international law must be respected. And that is why the small nations of the Caribbean community, way back in 1972, defied the mighty United States of America and the Organization of American States, who were attempting to impose a policy of isolation, diplomatic isolation on Cuba. And we said to them that we do not accept that Cuba should be isolated in our hemisphere. We will be establishing diplomatic, economic, trade, and cultural relations with Cuba. And this we did in December of 1972. And since then, we have gone on to say that we totally oppose the US embargo against Cuba, and we oppose it because it is contrary to the United Nations Charter, it is contrary to the principles of international law. In fact, we say that this idea of the unilateral imposition of coercive measures is wrong. The United Nations Charter makes it very clear. A country can only impose such measures if it is responding to an attack on it. In other words, if it is acting in self-defense, or if there has been a breach of the international peace and the UN Security Council approves such unilateral coercive sanctions. And so part of our diplomacy of peace is, in the case of Cuba, to call for the termination of the US embargo, but also in the case of Venezuela and other countries that are suffering the effect of unilaterally imposed coercive measures that have not been authorized by the United Nations Security Council. We too say that we are opposed to such measures. Finally, and I can mention many aspects of our diplomacy of peace, but I'll limit myself to just these three. Finally, the concept of the Caribbean as a zone of peace. This is a fundamental part of the diplomacy of both Barbados and the Caribbean community. We are conscious that one of the fundamental roots of this concept is a United Nations General Assembly resolution that was passed in 1978, authorizing regions of the world to declare themselves zones of peace and to adumbrate, put together principles that they wish to apply to their own region, principles of peace that are in keeping with the Charter of the United Nations. And since 1979, the Caribbean community has been developing this concept, this notion that the Caribbean is a zone of peace, must be respected as a zone of peace. The principles of the zone of peace are respect for the right of every nation to self-determination, the principle that says that there must be no interference in the legitimate internal affairs of nations, the principle of sovereign equality of nations, the principle that we must seek peaceful resolution of disputes, and the principle that says we must seek to cultivate a culture of peace. We are very committed to that notion of the Caribbean being a zone of peace. That concept was further confirmed in 2014 when the countries of CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, met in Havana, Cuba, and passed the Havana Declaration committing our entire region to being a zone of peace. So these are the concepts that we stand for. These are the principles of peace that we stand for, and we feel very strongly that more than ever, the world needs those principles now. As we face all of these existential challenges that are bearing down upon us, the world needs a diplomacy of peace and brotherhood and cooperation. And speaking for myself, I can tell you that I take a lot of inspiration from the late Hugo Chavez, who articulated a new concept of international relations, a concept of sharing of resources, a concept of solidarity and brotherhood and cooperation. And he demonstrated that in so many concrete ways, so many concrete programs and projects in our region. He had this notion of prosper thy neighbor rather than beggar thy neighbor, that we did not have to be involved in cutthroat competition. We could be invested in each other's success and in preserving each other's welfare. So I think it is very appropriate that at this World People's Congress for Peace, that we remember and lift up the name and memory of Hugo Chavez. My brothers and sisters, I look forward to us having a very meaningful and successful Peace Congress. Thank you.